Hello, and welcome to this episode of our cybersecurity focused podcast. I'm Shelly Kramer, principal analyst at Kramer&Co, and I'm joined today by fellow analyst Jo Peterson for a conversation with Tim Zonca, who's the VP of Portfolio Marketing at Commvault. And we are going to dive into the what, the why, and the hows of establishing a minimum viable company. Tim, welcome. It's great to have you.
Great. Thanks, Shelly. Thanks, Joe. It's good to be here.
Absolutely. So to set the stage a bit, the idea of a minimum viable company or business is not in any way new. Today, however, it's something that's becoming more important as organizations endeavor to protect themselves from cyber attacks and to focus even more on business resilience and business continuity when an outage or an attack happens. An MVC is the minimum set of apps and assets and things an organization needs to do and have in place in order to get up and running in the event of a cyber attack or a natural disaster or some other unexpected occurrence. So Tim, we've so been looking forward to this conversation. You ready to go for it?
Yeah, let's go.
All right. So let's start off with the basics. What is the concept of a minimum viable company, and how is that concept related to continuous business?
Yeah, you said a few things I want to touch on. So starting with continuous business. So if continuous business is the state of always on, always ready for an organization to fight through a cyber attack and remain operational, a lot of the practices associated with that are pretty progressive. You're doing things like, continuous cyber recovery testing, continuous scanning across your estate to make sure you're protecting your asset, especially your critical assets. Appropriately, and so on. And I think because so many of those practices are pretty advanced, a lot of the customers I work with, as they aspire to that continuous business, they say, what should I do next? And a lot of them focus on this idea of minimum viability, which is at least I want to make sure I can get up the basic, most critical aspects of my organization so that they can continue to serve their constituents. That might be making sure that they can support their customers and transact business. It might be making sure they could take care of patients. If they're an educational institution, that they can continue to educate their students. It may be, if it's a government department or organization, they can continue to serve their citizens, whatever is minimally viable for them to continue to deliver on their mission. Right. And so being able to maintain that and make sure that can especially fight through an attack and remain operational is critical for them to I think, continue to operate in a seamless fashion. And so that's become the focus for a lot of organizations as they strive to achieve continuous businesses. Is my minimum viability as bulletproof as possible?
Yeah. Well, it makes sense. And I think we've had some huge wake-up calls across the industry over the course of the last handful of years. And we've gone from, thinking about resilience and continuity, sometimes as an afterthought, to holy moly, what is the impact of, us having a shutdown, and what does that look like financially and for our employees and for our customers? And so I think we've had an awakening across the industry of how important this is, wouldn't you say?
For sure. Yeah. And I think when you see that, any sort of stuff like that in the news, it is a wake up call, which I think it forces organizations to question, what would happen? Would we be able to swiftly maintain our operations or at least restore them if there was some sort of downtime?
Right. Well, speaking of downtime, that was the perfect setup for my next question. Thank you. So speaking of downtime, it's of course important to know the cost of the downtime for the business itself, but that's not the whole picture. I mean, you've got regulatory issues, you've got customer impact, you've got reputational costs that occur, and these things all multiply, and that base cost of downtime is just one part of the equation. So will you talk a little bit about some of those other factors that play a role here?
Yeah, I think you mentioned a lot of, I think, the key things that customers look at, which is it a financial cost? Is it a reputational or trust kind of cost? Is it one associated with some sort of regulatory either requirements or fees or fines or what have you? And I think what's interesting that we see happening is though those are kind of common themes or common buckets where costs would come from, what constitutes minimum viability for each company is different.
Right.
And that I think what's we see happening is customers are really having an executive level conversation of what are the costs or the risks and what are the ones that we can tolerate for a little bit longer and what can't we tolerate at all. And those are the things that rise above the kind of the watermark or the line. You said
Right.
something, Shelly, at the onset, it kind of in your intro about this idea of minimum viability or continuity being kind of a old practice. And I think one of the things that's true is for decades at least, IT teams have been defining what are the critical key assets and classifying them, understanding
Right.
which parts of their estate have to adhere to certain regulations. I think what's different about minimum viability is if that was more of a bottoms up approach, this kind of flips it around and takes a top-down approach and where the business says, indeed, what constitutes minimum viability. And I think what's interesting is I've talked with some customers and prospects over the course of even just the last month, and let's take something like payroll, where there's been a debate where one organization's like, yeah, payroll for us isn't we wouldn't put that into our minimum viability. There's other things that would make it above the line first. And other organizations like, actually, based on our business, it has to be above the line. And
Right.
in the case of one of the organizations I talked to, they said, well, and this isn't because even if we could make sure that we're paying the folks that that we need to pay on a timely basis, there's tax implications for behind the scenes as they queue up a payment. And
Right.
so in their case, it indeed was critical, and there was a big cost associated with it, even if they're still operating and paying the individuals that's part of the payroll process on time. And so for them, it mattered a lot to them. For other
Yeah.
organizations, it didn't kind of hit that watermark. And so I think that's what's really interesting is that each business has to take a really kind of critical look around what they believe is minimally viable.
Right.
And then the executives and business leaders of those organizations then have to align. Is there alignment around
Right.
what is, and then what's the cost associated with helping maintain that minimum viability?
Yeah, and I think the key thing here is that these are not conversations that you have after a breach or other
Yeah,
occurrence.
good.
This is
It's too late.
fundamental, a fundamental part of business strategy. These conversations need to be had, as part really on an annual basis, I think, and reevaluating what you determined in the last 12 months, were these key elements and that sort of thing. So I think that is such an important part of the equation, that this is a
Yeah.
foundational part of business strategy.
Yeah,
It
indeed.
is.
Go
Yeah.
ahead, Joe.
Well, I was just gonna, as I'm sitting here listening to the two of you talk, I'm kind of thinking that, yeah, I get it. Every business is a little different and what matters to them is a little different. But I know that there are patterns that emerge. And as you talk to customers, I think there's going to be a few critical workflows that
Yeah.
every single customer needs to get squared away before any sort of disaster strikes. So talk us through what that research and all the work that you've done, what patterns have emerged there, and what are those critical workflows?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. So from a workflow perspective, it's not necessarily easy, but I think it's actually pretty straightforward. We see four kind of common steps, and they're not necessarily all linear. But it starts with you need access. So the first thing is after some sort of attack, are the your technology assets that are minimally viable, can you access them? So Active Directory is the common one. Like, is Active Directory up and running, and can people actually access these critical systems? So restoring that and making sure that's ready to go. I think the second thing is reestablishing secure communications, collaboration, things like email or messaging or what have you, so that the organization, the experts fighting through the attack and kind of restoring that minimum viability, they can do so in a trusted, secure, and kind of scalable way. And then it comes to the other couple steps are rebuilding the technology that runs the business. So this is usually, the third piece is some sort of application infrastructure rebuild process. And then the fourth is just restoring the data and rehydrating the data into that infrastructure. So those are the four kind of workflow elements we see. Some of them are happening in parallel, but I think and some are more sophisticated or more complex than others. But in short, you restore access, you restore comms, you rebuild your apps and infrastructure, and then rehydrate it with safe, trusted, kind of clean and restored data.
You make such a good point. People sometimes forget how email centric we all are, right? Particularly sometimes executives. So you talk about that AD and the ability to restore that. And you notice that you brought that back first. Is in the work that you're doing, are you seeing a realization hit people that they go, oh wow, I forgot how important this is? How does that sort of transpire?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. Like one is just like a common statistic out there is that 9 out of every 10 attacks it targets Active Directory to some degree. I mean, it's the keys of the kingdom.
Yeah.
The other thing that you really can't go a day without reading something about cybercrime and the prevalence, as sophisticated as it's gotten, the prevalence of just phishing attacks. And so when you combine those two things together, the likelihood is high is that bad actors, have made their way into Active Directory and somehow potentially into the email or kind of collaboration system.
Right.
So as you're restoring a business, part of what you need to ensure is that Active Directory access. Are we restoring a version that we have high confidence that it's clean and safe?
Mm-hmm.
And same thing when we restore some sort of emailing or collaboration environment.
Right.
Is that also a safe and trusted environment so that the bad actors aren't kind of watching our game plan as we attempt to restore other facets of the business?
I love that you mentioned collaboration platforms as well as email. We've done an episode here on really the cyber risks that collaboration platforms pose. And I think that, Jo, you mentioned we live in email, but the reality of it is we also live in our collaboration platforms, and whether that's WebEx or Teams or Zoom or whatever, but there are some inherent risks with that. So it makes perfect sense that you're giving them sort of equal weight.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we see a lot too is regardless if it's email or kind of document collaboration. So like Office Suite, being able to protect and back up and recover that in a cyber incident, like if M365, Google Workspace, those have become some of the most common and kind of prevalent starting points for organizations, frankly, that are new to the kind of the modern approach to cyber resilience.
Right. Yeah, makes perfect sense.
Yeah, it does. And if you've ever had the chance to watch Shelly and I work together before, then you know that we love a good stat. We love us a good stat. So we have to ask a stat question here. What number of days is considered the sort of mean or average of data recovery? And from the work you've done, can the average small or medium business even tolerate that amount of downtime? See, I'm setting you up for a softball here.
Well, softball or not, I think it's a good question because it teases out a few important elements of a cyber recovery strategy. So we use 24 days is the average time for an organization to recover after a cyber incident. I mean, if you look at just kind of a disaster event where it's some sort of outage or operational failure or even something like an earthquake or something, most organizations have gotten to the point where that's like pretty much real time. So if you're really looking though at a cyber event where you have forensics going on and you have notions of identifying clean points for recovery and going through those mechanics, especially before organizations start working, at least with Commvault, we see 24 is the average amount of days. And I think to your second question is, can most organizations tolerate that? Like, no way. And that 24 from what we see is actually not for like all things all in. Like sometimes we see organizations before we start working with them where it's months for them to just ensure that everything is really up and running. It's just for those critical kind of minimally viable assets.
Right.
And so a lot of times we're helping our customers work through being really precise about their recovery objectives after a cyber event? How, where is there room for data going back how many days or, hours or what have you? And where's there zero tolerance for that? I talked to someone who's like, look, 24 days, like we're out of business at that
It's
point.
a
Like
lot.
that, like, yeah, we can't tolerate anything close to that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's I think where, we come in is helping organizations kind of consolidate off, usually it's multiple systems, multiple approaches, many are kind of traditional approaches, and really to target winnowing that window down to as small as possible.
That's a
Thanks.
perfect answer, setting us up for our next question. So let's talk a little bit about best practices. I know there are some disaster recovery best practices that have emerged, and things like copies and testing and validation and forensics. You mentioned forensics just a minute ago. Can you do a quick run through for us of some of the thinking that the companies that you work with are going through, and what you personally view as the gold standard when it comes to disaster recovery and those best practices?
Yeah, we outline about 7 different best practices, but I'll touch on like the 4 that I think, you say like your favorite, or I think it's favorite. My bias is just because I talk with customers so much about them. The first is that for any of your critical data, organizations should have copies of that data in a virtually air-gapped location in someone else's cloud. And that is not a new practice, but it's interesting to see how there's so much room for organizations to still adopt that practice. So that's kind of the first one, is you should be virtually air gapping, the copies of your critical data in someone else's cloud. We have a capability even in multiple clouds. We've started to see some compliance mandates where you should have copies in multiple locations. So that's kind of one. The second thing is, one of the things that's different about a cyber event is you can't trust the data. So frankly, if you just rapidly just go restore your latest copy, you may be actually doing your organization more harm than good.
Right.
So the second practice is around being able to verify or actually identify a clean point or set of clean points to recover to. And that, I would say, is probably one of the hottest topics that I've been talking with customers about. One of probably the common thread across all the CISOs I talked to recently is they don't have confidence that they understand and have a codified process that they trust for identifying clean points to recover to. So having some process in place and making sure that especially security teams and IT teams are practiced and good at working through identifying clean points for recovery. That's, I think, the second practice. The third one we talk a lot about is, are you testing all this stuff? And so are you testing, again, back to this point where in a cyber incident, you're not just failing over to a DR location. You may make matters worse. You're actually restoring from backups. And that's something not people haven't practiced much, because I think DR has gotten so used to people flipping from one site to another. So frequently testing from backup as if it was a cyber incident, going through your clean point identification process, pulling from an air-gapped location. That's something that we believe, organizations before they start working with us, we see them doing usually some more like a simulation once a year. And ideally, the first thing we do is like, how can we get you at least quarterly, frequently testing from a backup and really getting practice at that? We have some customers that do it once a day. I just got an email from a customer who's like, hey, the first thing I check when I come in the morning is, did our cyber recovery test from Commvault succeed? And then I think the other thing is having an automation kind of set of practices and processes in place for recovering to a clean, isolated location where you could do forensics. It might be for additional clean point identification. It might be for kind of just verification, validation of that what you're recovering is indeed clean. It might be for a period of observability. It might be to give your insurance, your cyber insurance place to say, look, like we need our production environment. We made a copy of exactly everything. Go here, and use that. So I think the fourth thing we talk a lot about is how can organizations streamline and automate that, the forensic, like spinning up a copy for forensics teams.
I love it. I love it. I did a research study a couple of years ago, and one of the questions that and it never ceases to amaze me that one of the questions that we asked was around, how many cyber breaches did you have this year, and what kind of visibility do you have? Do you have like an observability platform, real-time access, real-time visibility, that sort of thing? And it was not surprisingly to either of you, I'm sure, but there were plenty of IT leaders who said, oh no, absolutely, we haven't had a breach. And who also said, oh no, we don't have any visibility. We don't have any real time. We're not looking at this in real time. And it's like, you have no idea. And so it was just so interesting that in this day and age, there are still people who don't understand that, you can't combat what you can't see in real time is just so critically important. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things, like, at least so people don't look to us for really visibility in their production environments necessarily.
Right.
But touching on something you said that we spend a lot of time working with our customers with is kind of visibility in a clean, isolated state. I think one of the reasons people don't do that often with something like an IRE or an isolated recovery environment, it's super expensive to like mimic your whole like chunk of your data center and all the permutations of the stacks and the apps that you want to restore. It's really expensive.
Yeah.
We've actually taken some pretty novel cloud techniques and some unique capabilities that Commvault has that allows you to recover any kind of data set into an isolated cloud location. So I think it's unlocked a period or a practice of kind of testing, of visibility, of forensics for that, especially observability of is the stuff that we believe is clean, is it truly clean, and do that in an isolated way where if they got it wrong, no harm done. Like you just kill it, it's gone, you spin it down and you can kind of re-find a clean point that you restored it, and then same thing. And then when you're not using those environments, it's the cloud. You're not paying for it. And so I think it's unlocked a whole new wave of testing, forensics environments, this notion of like observability before you move things back into production that formerly was just like untenable for most organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, the thread that connects my example from the research study and what we're talking about is that, I can't imagine doing what it is you're talking about once a year. I can't really even imagine doing it once a quarter, but you know what I'm saying? So I think that less often you look and assess and analyze, the more dangerous it is. So I'm a fan of actually that everyday business. And of course it depends on your business, your organization too. But
I think you're spot on. For as much as we talk about like in our space, cyber resilience and cyber recovery, the recovery is kind of the given at this point in time. And I don't want to minimize the complexity or sophistication that goes into that, but I would say we spend a lot of time talking about preparedness.
Right.
Do you understand what's minimally viable? Are you practicing going through the paces? Because you had mentioned something again in the introduction, by the time you're attacked, like it's too late. Like if you haven't gone through those paces, like you really want to kind of practice when times are good. So when you're under duress, you know what processes, who to call, who needs to be involved in which parts of the process, so that that's not happening under a pretty intense and crazy time.
It's like a fire drill, Tim.
Yeah, for sure.
You gotta do the fire drills so you know what to do when there's fire, right? So I know that Commvault has some unique capabilities in this space, and one of the things that is a particular interest, Jo and I have talked about a lot, is what you're doing around Active Directory. So I know our audience watching today, knows that AD is a key part of many enterprise IT infrastructures. Commvault has developed a way to automate Active Directory forest recovery to protect what you call the keys to the kingdom against ransomware attacks. And this is a big deal. So I would love for you to talk with us about how this product has evolved and how you're looking at it as, in terms of how it could be a game changer for organizations.
Yeah, I think what we've unlocked is the ability for organizations to recover Active Directory at massive scale, like so forest level recovery in an automated fashion. If you follow the steps from kind of the best practices and kind of documented steps from Microsoft, it's not uncommon for it to be a weeks long process, or I mean, in weeks plural, like multiple weeks process for an organization to fully recover Active Directory. We've done some really unique stuff that will automatically look across your topology, your various domain controllers or what have you, and kind of reverse engineer a set of runbooks that then will automate your custom implementation of Active Directory. And it makes it easy to like toggle on and off certain things because let's say if you're testing recovery, you may not need to do certain pieces of it, but the ordering is really critical. So that's something that we have that we've taken to market recently. And it's been really powerful to see, I think, organizations be able to now include this as part of their practice. Because frankly, backing up Active Directory, it's like it's easy. It's a long like solved problem. Recovering Active Directory, at least, in a kind of a granular way, same sort of thing. I think what's tricky is getting really quick recovery of massive, sets of accounts. Even if the data set isn't massive, it's so critical, and there's the massive set of accounts, and that's really complex. And so that's kind of the problem that we've tackled recently that has allowed organizations to really, I think, leapfrog their Active Directory protection and recovery practices compared to what they've done in the past.
Yeah, love it.
We've all heard the term hot standby in terms of additional production environments for ransomware recovery. And it can mean peace of mind, but it can also be super costly. You had alluded to that earlier, right? It's costly, it's hard to do. But you were also referencing some cool things that you've been able to pull off in the cloud that have allowed you to develop technology that's really a clean room recovery. And you've got another product called Air Gap Protect. How are putting those products in place for a customer going to actually give them that peace of mind and lower their TCO?
Yeah, I think you said something that is like a good place to start a response to this, which is around, the people have like hot, failover, whatever they call their like failover, hot kind of recovery environments. And I think that practice for an operational or kind of recovery scenario or a disaster recovery scenario where there's no malicious intent, you're flipping like that people have figured out how to do that in a reasonably cost effective way. I think the trick is when there's a cyber incident and you have to restore from a backup. One, that's more complicated. Two, you can't trust the data necessarily. You can't trust the applications or infrastructure. And sometimes attacks are even going into like firmware and BIOS. So you might actually have a really expensive recovery environment like an IRE. And if it's compromised, it may just burn through all of those resources and money, and now they're not trusted. And so I think that's the part that makes IREs like these isolated recovery environment locations that are just costly and frankly I think risky because you have to be able to build in this notion of we're certain that there's been no bad actors in there. We're certain that if they're, the AC or the HVAC's not going to be compromised and maybe we could recover everything, but this environment actually hasn't been isolated well enough. And now where we just recovered to is not going to help us. And that's where we've deployed this novel technology that bursts to the cloud. It automates provisioning of a place that didn't exist before. And why that's important is because if it didn't exist before, you know that it's compromise free, unlike a set of servers that you have, waiting for you in an IRE, and you weren't paying for it. You weren't paying for that cloud instance before it existed. So all of a sudden, I've talked to customers that said, "Hey, we spent $30 million in stuff to build out an IRE, and 3 years later, they're not there." And so we think that that's nonsense. And so being able to burst to the cloud to this location that didn't exist before, we automate the laying down of this isolated environment and then use some unique technology that allows us to take data that lives anywhere and recover it into that location. And, this is pulling, as you had mentioned, Joe, from this like air gapped kind of copy of the data.
Mhm.
I think it allows for really fast recovery and really cost-effective recovery. And so now things that were only available to some of the biggest, baddest organizations on the planet, like regional hospitals can now do, or kind of much, much smaller organizations that don't have to have this like really complex and sophisticated, recovery landscape, the experts to run it, the ongoing costs, all that can kind of be put by the wayside without diminishing any of the preparedness that the intent of that aims for.
I love the idea of an easy button.
Yeah.
Well, and beyond the easy button, I mean, fast and, more affordable. Like, who doesn't like that, right? So super, super compelling offering there. So Tim, as we wrap this episode, love for you to just leave us with one piece of advice for IT leaders thinking about MVC and what they need to prioritize as they work to establish an MVC for their organization.
I think the biggest thing is be ready and understand what your organization's currently doing to be prepared and ready, and interrogate what's the next thing that you need to do to be even more prepared and more ready in light of the advancing kind of cybercrime out there. I think that's the biggest opportunity. A lot of the recovery mechanics, they're largely a solved problem, but I think that the hard part is what could you do to make sure that your teams are ready? Are they testing frequently? How frequently is that? Well, how do they construct their tests? How involved is security in making sure that they're informing the kinds of recovery tests and clean point identification processes that are in place? And then your team's going through those paces and ideally doing it in a way that's automated so that your confidence is building over time. Because as people move to Commvault for the first time and we run them through these paces, we tell them like, hey, look, you're going to fail your first set of tests because it will uncover things that you won't have uncovered yet. And so our take is like, start there, like just go through those paces and learn as fast as you can around what needs to improve so that when things really hit the fan, your team has gone through their paces together. They've done it as a team and they've done it frequently. And so that they can then respond that much more effectively and quickly.
I love it. Plan, prepare, test.
Yep.
Do it all over again. Well, Tim Zonca, VP of Portfolio Marketing at Commvault, thanks so much for joining Joe and I today. It's been a fabulous conversation. We knew that it would be, and we look forward to continuing this conversation soon.
Shelly, Joe, thanks for having me. It was good to get a chance to talk with the two of you.
Thanks,
Absolutely.
Tim.
And that's a wrap for this episode of the Security Square. I'm your host, Shelly Kramer, Principal Analyst here at Kramer&Co. Thanks so much for joining us today. Hit that subscribe button if you've not yet done it, and we'll see you here next time.